I just want I want to remind you that the work that we do oftentimes is not easy to talk about or to hear about. And the conversation tonight is going to cover a difficult subject, human trafficking. And while we try not to overly share graphic details, it may be difficult to hear sometimes. And so if you feel overwhelmed, if you feel anxious, if you feel like you just need a break from it, don't hesitate to turn off your camera, walk out of the room, do what you need to do to take care of yourself. And also know that our hotline is available 24/7. You can call that number, and I don't know if we'll put it in the chat. We'll probably put that in the chat for you. So if you need to get some support or talk to someone anytime you need it, we're there for you. And with that, I want to introduce our president and executive director, Inga James, and Inga is going to bring us into the evening.
Good evening, everybody. It's great to see you. Really happy to be here and to talk about human trafficking this evening. It's a ridiculously extreme problem in Frederick County. And so we're going to talk about what some of the numbers are and about our regional navigator program in particular. We like to start with a definition of what human trafficking is. And so we always provide the legal definition. For an adult, human trafficking is any act that is compelled by force, fraud, or coercion. So those are the three key words: force, fraud, or coercion. So somebody does not have to be physically threatened. Fraud can do the trick. There are also more types of human trafficking than what we deal with here in Frederick County right now. We work with sex trafficking victims, but there are also labor trafficking victims, individuals who are forced to work either as a domicile or in manual labor or some other way in order to earn their freedom. Sometimes you've probably heard of stories like that. But there are also crime traffickers who force others to commit crimes for them. And then the last, which is probably the least well known, is organ trafficking, where an individual is forced to sacrifice an organ for the black market. The definition is different, however, for people under 18. Because no child under the age of 18 can legally be charged with, convicted of, or penalized for anything like prostitution. It is not a legal act, because anytime a child under 18 is advertised or solicited or exploited through a commercial sex act, that is human trafficking. So there doesn't have to be force, fraud, or coercion, because a child under the age of 18 cannot consent and therefore cannot make an informed decision about whether to participate, regardless of whether there's force, fraud, or coercion. What we find in the United States is that women generally are exploited sexually, and men are more often exploited in the labor market. We're just really getting a handle on the problem. 10 years ago, human trafficking was rarely prosecuted in the United States, much less Frederick County. But there's been a lot of research and increased awareness and education over the years that have brought us to where we are now, where we are actually just starting to hit the tip of the iceberg. Human trafficking is $1 billion business, and is very, very hard to detect, to identify, to find, and so it's a very easy business to run. And so what we have to do, or what we have had to do, is to learn about traffickers and their behavior and the tactics that they use and the ways in which they move people around. And so with a lot of education, research on the federal level and the state level, we're learning a lot more. And so we are seeing unfortunately, we're seeing our numbers explode. In the United States in 2020, there were about 2,200 individuals who were identified for sex trafficking for prosecution in the United States, only 2,200 in 2020. However, that's a 62% increase over 2011. So you can see how far we've come. In Maryland, we in 2019 identified a little over 400 victims. Along with 94 traffickers. You can see with 94 traffickers and over 400 victims, these traffickers end up exploiting a lot of people. And what we're seeing here in Frederick County, and I think Amy would touch on this, is that we get trafficking victims in groups because their trafficker is identified and arrested. And that's well, it's very troubling for one thing. But for the other thing, it's a great drain on our resources. Not only were 94 traffickers identified in 2019 in the state of Maryland, but 45 trafficking businesses. So cartels you might think about, as well as spas and other types of legitimate businesses that are front for sex trafficking. In Frederick County, we have a child sex trafficking regional navigator program, and Amy will go into great detail about this program. But we started it in 2020. I'm going back to my dates. And we have now 55 children. I think Amy said we just picked one up. 56 children, youth, and young adults on our child sex trafficking caseload right now from Frederick County. That number, remember I said that they come in groups, that number is up 65% since September of 22. So exploding is exactly the right word for it. Hartley House began thinking about human trafficking back in around 2015. Again, it was a nation type of area, and we were just learning about it. But I knew that where the research was leading us, and it was going to tell us that this is happening a whole lot more than we ever believed or wanted to believe. And so we, as an internal leadership senior leadership team, just started talking about adding human trafficking to our areas of power-based violence. And then in 2018, we actually were able to receive some funding to hire a human trafficking coordinator. She was a part-time person and helped put together the protocols, screening tools, public awareness events to get the human trafficking task force off the ground. Also in 2018, the county council created the human trafficking task force to put these mechanisms in place so that we could start identifying and serving victims and holding offenders accountable. That human trafficking task force has now morphed into what we call the human trafficking response team. It's no longer a task force of the county. It's now a standalone made up of stakeholders who are working in the area of human trafficking. In 2019, the legislature passed what's called the Safe Harbor Regional Navigator Program. The basics of this legislation is to equip each jurisdiction in the state of Maryland with a regional navigator, which is a fancy word for case manager, for child sex trafficking victims up to the age of 24. So the legislation provides standards for law enforcement, social services, and other agencies on how to identify victims, how to collaborate in the services of these victims and the prosecution of offenders, and also what types of services are to be provided, such as case management, counseling, legal services, and such, which we all provide. So this legislation created a regional navigator program for each jurisdiction. And each jurisdiction is required, well, the state required that each jurisdiction have one of these programs by 2023. And I think they're still working that out because it has not been what I would call the most successful program. Part of that is because we are just in kind of infantile phases of understanding human trafficking and how it really works in our country. So we're just we here in Frederick County totally underestimated the need when we were writing our grant proposals. So we currently do not have the funding that we need in order to handle the caseload. We have one regional navigator who handles all 56 of those cases with the assistance of Amy, her director. But it's quite challenging. Optimal caseload for a human trafficking, child sex trafficking caseload would be 12 to 13, and she has 56. So we are always reaching out to the state to try and acquire more funding. It's interesting because we don't have enough funding because we had a hard time anticipating what our need would be here in Frederick County. But there are some places who are refusing to pick up the program at all. So their money is just sitting there where we could use it because they are not interested in the program. And actually, excuse me, because it's legislated, the state is having to pull some pretty big strings in order to get programs to pick it up in other jurisdictions. So what we need, I'm going to turn it over to Amy in a minute, but I want to tell you what I think we need going forward. First of all, we have no funding for adult victims or survivors. We only have funding for child survivors, and it leaves a whole group of people left out. You've read about the spa arrest, the spas that are closed down because there is illegal activity going in. Some of these are human trafficking cases, and we don't have the capacity. We don't have any funding to serve adults. So that's a really big need. Another big need, and I say this because Harley House has found that when we develop a program, it's I won't even try and remember the name of the movie because I can't, but where they say if you build it, they'll come. We have found that over and over and over again, that when we have services to offer, the referrals just shoot in. And I know we would find the same if we were to start doing labor trafficking, because labor trafficking is happening out there. And so one of the needs Frederick County has is to investigate and examine these other types of trafficking, which right now are where sex trafficking used to be 10 and 15 years ago, still very infantile, not a great understanding of how it works, or how to find people. That's the really tricky part. So human trafficking is on our minds, and it's not a joke in Frederick County. And I'll let Amy talk more about that. Amy Wilkinson is our Director of Community-Based Services, and she oversees the Regional Navigator Program.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Thank you, Inga, for the introduction. So I'm going to go just review a little high-level stuff about the Screening Act and the Regional Navigator Program, and then I'll get a little bit more into detail about the processes and how they happen. So the Regional Navigator Program was established, like Inga said, in 2019, following the creation of the Child Sex Trafficking Screening and Services Act, which was signed into effect by the governor at the time. And the ultimate function of this law is to ensure that any child who has experienced sex trafficking in the state of Maryland has immediate access to services in their area. And that's why they're so focused on making sure that every jurisdiction has the same program that follows the same sort of process. So like Inga said, we call it child, they call it child, but the program does serve individuals up to the age of 24. So what this law did was, excuse me, was create a more concrete collaboration between law enforcement, local social service departments, and us at Hartley House. And it did this in effect by requiring that any child that come into contact with DSS, that's the Department of Social Services, be screened for sex trafficking. And if a child screens in as having been or being sex trafficked, then DSS automatically refers them to the Regional Navigator Program for services. And like Inga said, this isn't unique to Frederick. This is a state law. So what then happens? Well, the Regional Navigator Program is really a multifaceted kind of role. First and foremost, our regional navigator is an advocate. She's also a service provider and a coordinator. It looks like a lot of different things because it is so case specific, but some of the main services that are provided in this program are case management. We also do safety planning, emergency response, crisis intervention if needed, among others. The navigator works with our multidisciplinary team, which I'm going to get to in a little bit, to ensure that the needs of every child and family are being wholly addressed. Another thing that this program does is we serve the families of these children. So we are able to work with children and young adults, but we're also able to work with what we call secondary survivors. So think parents or siblings of a child who's experienced a situation like this. We also do some prevention work in this program. So in addition to those who have been confirmed or have a history of suspected history of trafficking, it's a weird sentence. We work with children and young adults who are what's considered high risk for future violence. We work with them and provide the same services in an attempt to prevent that from happening. So, so that all kind of works theoretically, right? But in function, what does it look like? So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to describe a case, and I'll start from incident to, and then I'll go from the incident to, well, I can't really say the resolution, but let's say until service is rendered, and I'll walk through the typical stages of what happens. So to set this up, let's say for this incident, let's say the child involved is 13 years old or 15, it doesn't really matter. And we'll say she is on Instagram and she gets a follow request that she accepts. And this account starts liking all her pictures and leaving comments, and then is swiping up on her stories. And it seems innocent at first, just DMs like, oh, nice shoes, which turns into, you look so pretty in this picture, which turns into, you're so mature for your age, right? So we know where that's going. And then he says, hey, let me get your Snapchat. And one thing leads to another. And then he's asking for nudes, and he says he'll send AirPods or money to a Cash App or whatever in exchange for him. It doesn't really matter. So she does it, and he does what he says, and he sends the money or sends the AirPods or whatever it is. And then he wants to meet, and he's been so nice, and he really does the things that he says he's going to do. And hey, he gave her presents, so clearly he cares about her. Right. Okay. So she decides to meet him, and I'm going to end the story there because we know what happens next. So I'm going to move on to the response. Okay, so let's say this child, after she meets with this man who turns out to be a 46-year-old dude, by the way, let's say she's not really sure how she feels about it. So she tells a friend at school, friend doesn't like it at all, and tells mom calls the school calls CPS, and CPS triggers the human trafficking protocol. So before anything else happens, before any police investigation, before anything, we have what's called an MDT meeting. It's a multidisciplinary team meeting, and they pull together all the key players in this case. So that would be usually the detective on the case. It would be the state's attorney's special victim prosecutor, I believe. It would also be CPS, the CAC, us, the FBI, sometimes Homeland Security. Really depends on the case who's pulled in. I think that's all of it. Am I missing any big players in the MDT? I can't think of anybody. Sometimes it's state to police. It really just depends on the jurisdiction. So we would meet at the MDT and we would discuss what the next steps need to be to address this case. And in this case specifically, it would be forensics. So that would be a forensic interview and a medical exam, and that would be done at the CAC. That's our Child Advocacy Center. That's where we come in usually. We being me or Jen Collins, our regional navigator. And that's when we would meet with the family. We like to do all of the intake information at once so the family doesn't have to repeat it or sit through it multiple times, because it's a lot of paperwork. And we try to be respectful of their time and recognize that it's not something that anybody wants to be doing. We also observe the forensic interview. So we never have to ask the child like what happened or anything like that, because we were there to witness the interview. So we can take all of our information from this one encounter. From that point on, the Regional Navigator Program becomes, I guess, the anchor for this family. If they need emotional support or advocacy with other agencies, or they want to know what's going on in the case, or they need crisis intervention, the family can reach directly out to our regional navigator to ask for those things. And they don't have to explain anything, because we know what's going on. And we're able to work with those agencies. We're able to text and call directly with the child once we have consent from the parent. If the child's under 16, yeah, if they're over 16, we don't need parental consent. So we're able to work directly with people and really provide, a focused set of services. So from there, Jen would probably recommend counseling for the child and for the family if they're interested, or if they feel like they want it. Our legal team would be able to do protective orders on behalf of the child and the family, although probably in this case, this person would be in jail. Well, anyway, in theory, the legal team could do protective orders. And I think that we have a, what is it called? A support group, a clinical support group for parents of children who have been trafficked. I'm not sure if it's running right now or not, but we do have that program as well. And we refer parents to that. So once everyone's engaged in services and we have a long-term plan, from there, we just continue to work with the client, and we're able to stay with that child until she turns 24 years old. They can request for their case to be closed. We have not had that happen yet. So we could carry on working with this individual and their family until they turn 24, at which point their case would close through the child program. But we would be able to sort of interdepartmentally, and ideally with with more staff, we would be able to provide ongoing services into adulthood for these children victims. And that's how it works. So I also want to talk a little bit about when we get a case in, these initial meetings and interviews and paperwork, just once we get the case in the first week, because when these things come in, it's usually in crisis stage. So we have to move fairly quickly. Not counting paperwork for one case takes about 5 to 6 hours. And that's just the initial meetings and interviews. That's nothing to do with ongoing conversations, scheduling intakes on our end or any of that. And that's just for, so one case, 5 to 6 hours. Right now we have 55. We've got one pending. So you can imagine the amount of time that's going into all of these cases. We do have cases that Inga mentioned that kind of come in bulk, where we'll have one trafficker. I apologize if you can hear my dog barking. He's locked out and he's so upset about it. So I'm sorry if you can hear him. He's distracting me for sure. But we do have cases that come in, in bulk. So we'll have one trafficker, 7 kids. And so those weeks are very challenging to get through when we're getting through scheduling and all of that. And I also want to just clarify, excuse me, that the type of case that I've explained here is a very specific type of case. We see a lot of this variety. We do also see pimp controlled trafficking and familial trafficking, but those aren't, those cases are usually discovered. They're not disclosed nearly at the rate that this type of case is disclosed. So so the rates are much lower on those controlled types trafficking situations. And I think that's all that I had. So I'm happy to answer any questions if anybody has any questions about human trafficking or about the program.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
When I think of human trafficking in Frederick County, I think of people passing through the county, that's what a lot of it is. But I'm picking up from you it's local people
Mhm.
that are being trafficked?
Yeah. So I think that there are there's a lot of information in media that's out there that suggests that human trafficking is, you know, people and children kidnapped from other countries, brought here, and that does happen. And we in fact have had cases like that. But the majority of the cases that I'm seeing are children from Maryland being trafficked in Maryland. Yes. We do, I mean, the majority, not all. We do have cases from out of state. And when that happens, we will transfer their case to, if they want to go home. Like, for example, we've transferred a case to a state where that individual was from. We got her back to her home, and then we transferred all that there. That's one way that a case would close if they transfer out of our jurisdiction. But yes.
Amy, how is the FBI involved? What does that look like?
So I can't really get into who does what, where, when, and how, because I don't know the answer to that. I do know that if it is a federal crime, then usually the FBI is called in. So that could look like somebody crossing jurisdictional lines to engage in trafficking of some sort. And primarily that's when we see like people from, so if we had let's say like a John travel from out of state into Maryland, that would be a federal crime. And I even think that there's some interstate stuff, but I'm not sure exactly how that works. So it would just depend on what happened, where it happened, when it happened, and to whom. I'm sorry, that's a non-answer, but that's all I know as to who they choose to call.
It's also important to understand that a significant portion of children who are trafficked by their family or by a caregiver, a loved one. And so it's not uncommon, and it's happening in our neighborhoods because it does happen within families. So something like taking a child to the movie theaters on Sunday and passing him or her off to a man. That kind of thing happens here.
So those kinds of things aren't federal crimes?
Some, yeah. I mean, yes, but it depends, again, it depends on what happened exactly, and where the other person traveled from. And I'm not an attorney, so I'm not sure, like, but yeah, it really depends on the circumstances. We have worked with, like I said, Homeland Security. Actually, we work with them fairly frequently. They have their own trafficking investigative program, I guess. But yeah, the FBI has been involved with us. I would say probably 1 out of every 5 to 7 cases we're seeing FBI involvement. So we work with them a handful.
Well, you can let your dog in.
I'm going to. I'm so sorry. Just go sit down.
This is Annette. I had a couple questions, and maybe you spoke about them because I did have to jump in a little late. My questions I had was because I know I have been learning through Hartley House that it's not stranger danger. It's mainly families that are trafficking other family members. And so how in our community, in our neighborhoods, do we identify that if we see somebody? Is there any way to identify that? And then the other part of that question is within the school systems, especially for the kids, I know they get trained on stranger danger, and teachers have to report, or people who work in the school system, they're mandatory reporters. But how does that work now that sex trafficking and labor trafficking is starting to become a conversation?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I will tell you, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. Maybe Jen does. So sorry to put you on the spot if you know it or not, Jen. We do know that the majority of children under, I believe it's 12, might be 14, majority of children under 14 who are being trafficked by a family member. Out of our 55 cases right now, I can think of two or three that had familial involvement. So what I can say is we don't have the manpower to investigate and discover these cases. They are happening. And the way that we could catch them in a more meaningful way would be if we could provide prevention education in every classroom in Frederick County. If we were able to provide more information to children about the types of things that we know are happening, and we could provide it in a way that's incremental, understanding, and age appropriate, we would likely see more disclosures. I am an educator at heart, though not at Hartley House, but I do believe that education is a primary prevention technique when we're talking about things, not only human trafficking, but other types of violence that happen in the community. So yes, it happens. Yes, sometimes we catch it. But like I said, for the most part, when we are getting disclosures, we are operating almost entirely on disclosures of children or their parents right now. And so parents, friends, family of some sort. And children who are being trafficked by their parents are not, to my knowledge, are not disclosing to schools what's happening. And there's a whole lot more into that about the dynamics of familial trafficking that probably would have another hour conversation on. But so unfortunately, I think that's kind of a non-answer. But yeah, to paraphrase, we're not catching those cases, which is obviously terrible.
I appreciate it, because then you know where the gaps are, where you can kind of focus.
Yeah, so the teachers and staff at FCPS do get some training, but it's not enough. It's really not enough. And I'm not sure what they're getting since COVID. I feel like they were getting a good bit during COVID and before. But I don't know how consistent it is. And again, I don't know exactly who's doing it. There's a couple of the people who work in FCPS that help teachers who have reached out to us to do training for their staff, but we haven't been asked to train like all the staff on what to look for and how to, report and things like that.
The other big group of sex trafficked individuals are runaways. Kids who've left home because of the abuse at home, usually of some sort. So and so put that together with the fact that a significant number are trafficked by their own families, and we've got a lot of work to do in our families. If we really want to prevent human trafficking, then we've got to work on our families and get some strength and some empowerment and some prosperity going.
Hi, this is Darlene. I do have a question regarding circling back to the schools. So are the schools getting asked to be involved in the conversations regarding human trafficking when they're talking about cases of COVID and talking about closing down? Because as soon as the schools close down, those children are not, they're stuck in a home or a place where there's no mandatory reporting, nobody's seeing what's going on. And that definitely was a big thing when we weren't going anywhere for a couple of years. But now that everything's back, but they still talk about closing down, are they bringing stuff like that into the conversation?
I can't speak for the school system and the conversations that they're having, but maybe Jen can. I don't know the answer to that.
Well, again, I think every place was caught off guard when everything had to shut down so fast. And I don't think any of us who do this work were surprised at the speed with which predators and traffickers move their operations online. But I know
Yeah.
that the adults who don't do this work were not prepared for that and were ill prepared to deal with it when it did start happening. And so we've kind of been trying to offer support on the other side of it. I know, I mean, you all might know this, but reports to CPS for child abuse went down about 70% during COVID. And for the same reasons you said, Darlene, it wasn't because the abuse stopped, it was because the people that see them were not seeing them. And we know the ramifications from that are going to be rippling for years to come. So it's a difficult situation with Frederick County Public Schools because they have to invite us to come in. We can offer all day. We have offered, I've been in the schools a pretty good bit recently, but it's just one school at a time and it's at their invitation. So getting in there on like a wide scale is something that is absolutely on our list of things we want to be doing. It's just figuring out how to make that happen that we're still working on.
Yeah.
Is there any way that can be helped, that process can be helped? Is there any way that we as advocates can encourage an invitation? It seems like a really important, such an important asset to the conversation.
You're very right. And what we have to get to before we can ask for assistance with advocacy is we don't have the people to do it.
Sure, yeah.
So we have to find the funding in order to, what we want to do is embed people in the school system that are working with health teachers and counselors and student groups and doing all kinds of prevention work. But we just don't have the capacity right now.
Sure.
And thank you for the offer. We'll take you up on it one day.
Oh, absolutely.
But that's kind of my line to jump in and thank you guys, because as members of the Healing Heart Circle, you're helping us with funding that we wouldn't be able to do some of this work. And the work that we continue to do will continue to grow as we grow this circle of support from the community. Our grants are great, and you know, they're big buckets of money, and they have strings and they have specific things that we can do with them. But you all on this call have generously given so much and continue to give so much, and that really helps us to continue the work. So another reason why, even though sometimes these topics are really difficult and this information is kind of mind-blowing sometimes, like what in my neighborhood, but I really appreciate that you're taking the time to get to know what your investment is impacting. And part of what you can be doing to help is talking about it. You know, talk about it with friends and family, talk about it at book club. The more people that are aware, it's kind of that. We need to continue opening our circle, I call it opening our aperture, helping the community see us in a broader way, and not just the place for a shelter for women and children, you know, a lot more.
And if I can just add on there, I know we did a Healing Hearts briefing specifically about human trafficking already. And this one was really to let you all know more about that Child Navigator Program. And about a year ago, Amy made a video for our website talking about the child trafficking and just about child trafficking in general, but really about Frederick County. And at the time, she noted that we had 3 cases, and we talked about how many that was for Frederick County. And it's a year since we made that video, and we're at 55. So I really just wanted to emphasize what Inga said. I know a lot of us on staff, when we brought in this navigator, we're like, okay, this is someone we need, but is she going to have enough work to do like a full-time job? And I wish we hadn't said it out loud to the universe, but we did. And she does. She has enough work for 3, I would say 3 or 4 people. So yeah, for 4 people. So that to go from 3 cases a year, go to 55 now is astronomical. And to put all of that work on one person and I know there's supports in her department, she's supported by our staff, but it's still one person is basically carrying 55 cases, and that is intense. And so making sure that she's supported, that she's getting what she needs to be able to do this work is important, but just having more support for that. I didn't want to I just felt like it was important to emphasize the growth that we've had just in 1 year in that
Yeah.
one,
In just that one area.
Mhm.
Yeah, and if I could just say a few more good things about our regional navigator, just really to, I'm very fond of her. So, I talk a lot about the start of the program and how it's so intense and this and that, but I'm amazed every day by, the continuous attention that she provides to these children who really need it. She knows when their proms are, whether they have dates, what they're interested in, what memes they like. She's in she's in an appropriate level of communication with these kids based on their level of need. And so it's not just meetings and all of that. She's texting regularly with them and making sure that they're going to school and that they have, the stuff that they need to do their homework. We've helped, find housing and provided school supplies. So there's a lot of behind the scenes stuff that she does that may seem maybe even, inconsequential to some, but for a child who's experienced something terrible like this, having an adult that you can talk to who checks in regularly and consistently. And let me tell you, these kids, not always nice. They don't text back for a year and a half, and then we hear from them in crisis, but we're hearing from them. They're there. They know that we're here. And no matter how many times people, leave her on red, she just continues to carry on with making sure that these kids know that we're here and that we'll continue to care for them. So, I don't want to downplay all of those little things. She's incredible, and it is a huge amount of work to keep up with all of these teenagers and young adults and children and kids. So.
I
Can
have
I ask a
another,
question about, what about hotels and things in the area? Do they get training from us, or do we talk about it, or do they
Yeah.
ask us?
Part of the legislation that was created by the county council requires that hotels in Frederick County, their staff get trained annually. And there have actually been victims identified by hotel staff because of that training. So yeah, they do get training. Anybody, anything else?
I just had one more quick question, Inga. This is Annette again. Is there any statistics or maybe anything regarding people of special needs or vulnerable population? Are they trafficked higher? And they may not, the reason why I'm asking that is because I have become, in my LFC class, the person who's in charge of the special education with Frederick County. So I'm just wondering if I have, it'd be helpful to have a conversation with her to see if there was anything, a route to go that way. So that was just an idea that popped in my head. So.
Yeah, special populations are always at higher risk because they have more vulnerabilities and they have generally fewer protections in the community, because particularly people who have intellectual disabilities have a harder time protecting themselves. So yeah, they are at higher risk. And right now we don't have any programming around that population at all.
Okay. Yeah, if it's something we can talk offline, if it's something
Yeah,
to pursue. So
sounds good. Anybody else?
I just wanted to say, that I think it's worth mentioning, especially when you're talking about this in the community, that you don't need to be a teacher or mandated reporter or even necessarily be trained to make a CPS report. If you think that something suspicious is happening, you may very well go ahead and call them yourself and make a report for them to check in on these things. That's something actionable that anyone can do. So if they do see signs, especially, and they are trained, it can be important to make those reports. The worst thing that can happen is CPS can come in and say nothing's wrong. But best case scenario, we identify somebody and we're able to get them help.
Thank you, Jesse. Yeah. So, and we also do training around red flags and things like that, so that people it will help them to keep an eye on different things. So, but if there's nothing else, I will say adieu and thank you so much for joining us, and have a great evening. Happy Valentine's Day.
Thank you.